It's amazing to me that we were looking here in John 17:26, and he's connecting there, Yeshua, declaring the name of his Father with that love. And I was looking at this before in the NIV, and I couldn't believe it. So the NIV changes the words in Greek, your name, tohonomasu. It changes your name to you. So it pulls out the name of the Father, just making it now, I have made you known. Well, that's very different. Now, that name is key, and as you mentioned, his arrival in Jerusalem and the people proclaiming, and in the English Bibles it says, blessed is you comes in the name of the Lord, but it's quite clear, no one disputes, that this comes from the Psalms it's Psalm 118, verse 26, which says, Baruch haba b'shem Yehovah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yehovah. So if he's speaking he's speaking Hebrew in the first century, not English, he's going to say the actual name Yehovah. This is before the rabbis instituted this ban on the name. And I'm looking at this, and of course I'm looking at this as a scholar of ancient texts, and I'm saying, wow, clearly here in this historical context, he's actually speaking the name. And then for him to say in Matthew 23:39, and look at the context of Matthew 23:39 before we get to that verse. He says in 38, see, your house is left to you desolate. He's talking about the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD. It hadn't happened yet.
And he's on the Temple Mount at that time.
So and you have that in your book, The Chronological Gospels, about that whole chronology, which is maybe less clear from Matthew, but you've worked it out. So then in verse 39, he says, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of Yehovah. And his disciples are probably thinking, we just said that in your chronology. It's 2 days before or 4 days before, right? We just said it. What do you mean you won't see me again? Well, what happened in the century after that is the rabbis came along and made it forbidden to speak the name Yehovah. And so imagine if he were to arrive today in Jerusalem and the people would, let's say they recognized him as the Messiah, by rabbinical ban, they wouldn't be allowed to do this. They wouldn't be allowed to say, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yehovah. And I think that's what's happening in in John 17:26, when he says, I have made your name known and I will declare it. And that connection with love, what jumped out for me from that is something I brought in I have this teaching called 10 Rabbis Who Speak Out on the Name on my website, nehemiaswall.com. And there I bring this verse, and I'm not thinking about John 17 when I bring this verse. I'm thinking about what the rabbis are saying. It's Psalm 91:14. It says, because he has set his love upon me. And there it's talking about Israel, because Israel, or ever who loves God, right? Maybe it's just not Israel. Maybe it's anybody who's called to the God of Israel. Because he has set his love upon me, therefore will I deliver him. I will set him on high, because he has known my name. So here in the Bible, in the book of Psalms, is a connection between loving the Father, setting your love upon the Father, and knowing his name. Now, when you read this in Hebrew, what the rabbis saw here was a reference not just to the name, but the actual pronunciation of the name. And how did they see her connection to the pronunciation of the name? The word for love here is a very unusual word for love. The normal word for love in Hebrew is ahava. Like, for example, it says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as you love yourself. V'ahavta et Yehovah Elohecha, love Yehovah your God. Here it's a completely different word for love. It's the word chashak. Chashak or chashak, the rabbis understood this as an acronym that represented the pronunciation of the name. Because if you take it as an acronym, this word for love, chashak, is cholam, shva, kamatz, and those are the three vowels of the name Yehovah that was understood for the last 1,000 years and more by Jewish sources. They talk about this, that's in my 10 Rabbis. We actually talked about this in the Gentiles Shall Know My Name teaching that we did together. Now, there's a rabbi in the 12th century who ties it all together, and he doesn't know John 17:26. He's just looking at Psalms and realizing the same thing that I think Yeshua was teaching, based on Psalm 91:14. This Rabbi David Kimchi in the 12th century says, knowing the Tetragrammaton, that's the 4-letter name of the Father, knowing the Tetragrammaton is loving God, blessed be he. And this is the greatest achievement that a person can achieve while he is still a body. And you know, I read that and I get chills that today we've been told, I was told as being raised as a Jew, that we're not allowed to speak this name, and the pronunciation of the name is a secret. And even if we know it, we must never speak it. And here we have this concept here that setting the pronunciation of God's name, that is knowing his name and loving him. It's all tied in there together. And then Yeshua says the same thing in John 17:26. I find it hard to believe this is a coincidence. There must be some connection here between, and it's all coming from Psalm 91:14, I think. Meaning like that Yeshua read this and understood what it meant, the same way that later Jews throughout the centuries understood it, that this is a reference to the pronunciation of the name. And that Yeshua would say this in the first century, I think is pretty profound. Because if Yeshua is who you believe he said he is, then he knew the temple would be destroyed. He knew the rabbis would come along 100 years later, and they would forbid people to speak the name. And he said, you ain't going to see me again. I am not coming back until you say my Father's name again, the name I made known to you, the name that I declared to my disciples. And I will make it known. I will declare it, he says in John 17:26. It all ties together. It's pretty cool stuff.
There it is. The restoration of his name,
yes.
And the pronunciation, because that's part of the restoration.
Oh, absolutely.
This is something that has now, in this generation, this has come to pass. And it was one of your relatives that actually hit it, one of the famous rabbis.
So this is one of the things we talked about in the Gentiles Shall Know My Name series. And that people can still get in a DVD. Wonderful, beautiful. One of the best teachings I've ever done. I'm really appreciate that you had me here to talk about that, and you have me back to talk about these further discoveries. So at the time when I was doing that research, I knew about originally 5 manuscripts that had the full vowels Yehovah. Most places in those manuscripts you could not find the full vowels. The name was unpronounceable. The rabbis, and this is based on the rabbinical ban on the name. They don't want people speaking it, so they leave out one of the vowels. So if a Jew
and it was accidentally put in.
Yeah, but it was a slip of the scribe. What we today call a Freudian slip, right? The scribe, in a sense, the scribe knew in his head how to pronounce it, and he put in the full vowels. And it happened 7 times in the Aleppo Codex, about 50 times in the Leningrad Codex, and then we found it in other manuscripts. Well, I had found these 16 rabbis who explicitly said the name was Yehovah. I want to bring one of these. And this is the one who you mentioned, who turns out he's my ancestor. He's my 11th great-grandfather. And the context here is amazing. He starts out this letter that was never supposed to be made public. He's writing to another rabbi. He says, "Know, my beloved, how extremely difficult it is to put things like this in writing, and even more so a letter sent about from place to place concerning the vowels of the Tetragrammaton, which are Shva, Cholam, Kamatz." And Shva, Cholam, Kamatz in Hebrew is Yehovah. Those are the names of the vowels.
No question about it.
No question about it. And those form the word chashak as an acronym, which is the word for love, that apparently Yeshua is making a play on words on in John 17:26. And also here we have Rabbi David Kimchi is making that connection. And he goes on in the letter. He says, and he talks about his grandfather saying the same thing. And he talks about his grandfather wrote a book. And it says, because of its immense holiness, it was never printed, that it not be used by those who are not worthy. In other words, he's writing a letter with information that he's explicitly telling you is meant to be kept secret. This is never meant to be get out to the public. Michael, this is the WikiLeaks of the 17th century. That is, these are these literally secret communiques that we now have access to. And why do we have access to them? Well, he goes on at the end of the letter. He says, "I have one request, that you hide this letter in a pure and holy place and not allow it to be passed around here and there." And the other rabbi wrote back and he said, "It's hidden in my vaults." So why do I know what it says in the letter of my 11th great-grandfather, who quotes my 13th great-grandfather, his grandfather? How do we have access to this information? Well, a couple things have happened. We live in an era where knowledge is increasing, as it says in the book of Daniel, chapter 12. And that's part of what happened. But in 1618, my 11th great-grandfather died. And his disciples went to his office, gathered up all his letters, brought him to a printing press, and printed them in a book. That in itself wasn't enough for us to know about it today. I was able to find this because scholars for the last, since the 70s, I'm bad at math, 4 decades, have been typing in letter by letter as every word of rabbinical literature. And today I can go and they haven't finished, right? They've only done 100,000 books from the last 2,000 years. But I can search those, and that's how I found this letter. From 1608, which is then printed in 1618 and then typed up sometime in the last 40 years. So I can now access this information. Imagine that. This is one page out of 100,000 books, and I was able to find it. I mean, if you look at what happened with WikiLeaks, all these emails were released. Well, releasing the emails isn't enough. How do you search them? There's tens of thousands of emails. Well, that's the beauty of the period we live in today, that we can get to this information, that it's available to the public. And I was able to find this letter, and I ended up finding 16 rabbis who explicitly said the name is Yehovah. They identified the vowels by name, Shvach Olam Kamatz, that formed the acronym Chashak, which is love.